point, so I plan on making a couple of more comments, and I want to pose a couple of questions for you, perhaps more elaboration. One comment I'd like to make in terms of the American Muslim community, and particularly to those of you who have immigrated here, understanding the history of what's taken place to communities before, including the American Muslim community, is very important for you all to understand where we're at now and how we can move forward. Like Mike mentioned, in terms of how the ACLU was formed to begin with and what the United States government was doing. Alabama at one time had made the NAACP illegal, where the government literally attacked the civil rights organization to the point that it was made illegal, and obviously that was later repealed. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and his organization was infiltrated, and there were dirty tricks that were used against Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Malcolm X was under FBI and NYPD surveillance. His chief bodyguard the day that he was assassinated was a guy named Gene Roberts, who was an undercover agent. And all of Malcolm's bodyguards that day happened to have been unarmed. You understand what I'm saying? That what's going on right now with the Muslim community and other communities, there's a history of this going on. So we need to understand where we fit in this history and what took place before so that we can move forward. This is one point I'd like to make. The second point is I didn't mention this earlier, but we have more than one lawsuit against the FBI right now. I mentioned the wrongful death lawsuit of Imam Amin Abdullah. May Allah's mercy be upon his soul. The other one is we have a lawsuit in federal court regarding this invasive religious questioning that law enforcement is involved in by Customs, Border Protection, CBP, and the FBI. For when people are returning back in the country from Canada, or flying back in, predominantly driving back from the Ambassador Bridge, and being held for a number of hours. And then an FBI agent will then come there to the border, or sometimes they have follow-up visits later on, and they're asking these questions relating to this radicalization theory that Mike talked about. Do you pray? How many times a day do you pray? Which mosque do you go to? Do you pray Fajr prayer, the dawn prayer, inside your mosque? Who is your sheikh or who is your imam? They've even asked some of our imams question, how do you feel about this particular verse in the Quran? What does this verse mean? Do you fast Ramadan? So they're using religious practice almost as like a predicate for criminal behavior. This is exactly what the FBI is involved in doing. And we have a lawsuit against this invasive religious question. So this is something else I wanted to mention. Now, and obviously this goes back to the chilling effect that I talked about in terms of religious practice, religious expression. The ACLU actually had a report a few years back, and it focused on Dallas-Fort Worth area as well as metropolitan Detroit. I believe it was called freezing faith, blocking charity. I'm actually quoted in that report, but it mentioned that right here in this area, that people began to be scared of giving zakat to particular organizations as charity, and that people were scared to come into the mosque based upon they felt like they were being surveilled, or that by their mere giving more charity or coming to the mosque to pray for the morning prayer would trigger some type of investigation against them. So this is very important. Like the actions that are taking place, both from a legislative and lobbying perspective, but also from litigation, is very important in terms of what's going on to our community. Now, the other thing I wanted to mention, I want to pose a question to you to elaborate on more, but it relates to the informant issue. And in terms of the recruitment of informants in general, but in the Muslim community, we've seen three types of people who have been approached to be informants, and God knows how many people have actually successfully have been recruited to be informants. The first is what Mike talked about, is someone themselves have gotten in some sort of criminal problem. They have a case, could be related to fraud. Many of them are already citizens. So they use this situation of this case as a way of trying to get the person to be an informant so that they won't go to prison, won't be prosecuted. They make a deal. If you act as an informant inside your mosque, you go to the dawn prayer, you let us know who comes there regularly, you let us know what the imam is saying during the lectures, then, we'll let you go. The second issue is the person who's the immigrant, who's trying to get citizenship. They're trying to get citizenship. Maybe it's a visa, or they're trying to get citizenship, and the government will come to them and say maybe they didn't dot an I or cross a T correctly. Then therefore, the threat of deportation, that if you don't cooperate and act as an informant, the implication is you will then be deported. This is the second type of person who they try to get to be an informant. The third person, and the third type of person, in which we found this out in the Imam Luqman case of a brother who came to us and said he was approached, is financial incentives. Someone who has financial problems, he's in a particular mosque, they then go do a credit check. And any of us can do a credit check on him. When you go put in my name and pay $30 and find out my credit history, anyone. They did a credit check on the guy, and he's in a lot of debt. They said, oh, we see you're in a lot of debt. It looks like you're on the verge of filing bankruptcy. We can help you out with some of that credit card debt or some of that debt you have. We see you're about to lose your house. You're about to lose your house. You're behind on your mortgage or whatever. But we can help you with that so that your family's not homeless. You can get rid of this debt if you work for us as an informant and let us know what the brother's doing in the mosque. So this is what takes place. In regards to the first type of person who gets to be lured, who's already involved in criminal activity, and I say this all the time, that these types of informants are not patriots. They already themselves are criminals and have a lean towards criminal behavior to begin with. So they're not patriots trying to make our country safer. They themselves are trying to get out of their own case. The other two groups of people, because their circumstances are being more so pressured, or, well, the second one especially, we could even, I don't want to use black as the proper word. I'll say white male, because I don't like how black is always attached to everything negative. You're being white male. It's undue colorism. But they're being pressured to act as informants. And the third person is in a difficult situation. Is in a very difficult financial situation, and sometimes people may do things out of desperation, thinking they may not hurt people. So that's what's going on in terms of informants. Now, since you being a former FBI agent, Mike, and you knowing about the protocols, I'd like you to discuss, do FBI agents have quotas in terms of informant recruitment? And if they do have quotas, what is the incentive to them for their careers or their performance evaluation to have a certain amount of informants, and then those informants in fact effectuate arrests?
So yes, that's really part of what's driving the problem, is that informants FBI agents are required to have informants. There was an IG report on a number of FBI investigations, inappropriate FBI investigations of domestic advocacy groups. This came out in 2010, and one of the agents described there had used his son's teenage friend to go to these anti-war rallies. and collect information about the entirely First Amendment activity of the people involved in this group. And when the Inspector General said, what were you doing? He said, I had to show participation in the program. So, that's true across the FBI's different investigative types. The problem with terrorism is because terrorism is so rare, there aren't a lot of terrorists out there, knock wood. But they still have to have informants, and they still have to have those informants producing information, which is why you see them putting them into law-abiding communities trying to stir up information. Because you can imagine you've gotten yourself in a little bit of trouble and the FBI says, okay, here's this path out, become an informant. Well, you know that if you become an informant that goes into the community and says there's no criminal activity going on, you're going to lose that deal, right? They're going to say, you're not really doing your job, we're going to take away the deal, you go to jail. So what happens is you twist the incentives of that informant to find somebody he can convince to commit some kind of criminal act. And that's where, the use of informants in law enforcement is always dangerous. But that's where things get really dangerous, where the FBI is, or any law enforcement agency is tweaking the incentives of the informants to create crime rather than just report about crime. Another thing we're seeing that fits with this immigration prospect.
Is there any definition for terrorist? What do you mean by terrorist? Because every individual, when they explain as throughout the history, they have different criteria for terrorism.
Right.
What actual terrorist is the one FBI is looking for?
So the FBI does have a definition that they work off of, but for the most part, which is interesting with the training, because we have training. Any government has sort of a bias and a suspicion of things that will change the power structure. Right? The existing power structure likes being the power structure. So anything that challenges that is a threat to them, not necessarily a threat to security, but a threat to their continued enjoyment of the power and privilege that they have. So there are some groups that are sort of natural targets for this suspicion, and that's new immigrants who are coming in and changing the demographics, racial and religious minority groups who are agitating for their rights, and political advocacy organizations, right? Organizations that are trying to use legal tools to challenge the power structure as it exists. So when the FBI's rules are changed so they're not focused on criminal behavior, that opens the door for them targeting these groups, and that's exactly what we've seen. Our Southern California affiliate actually just put out a report on the way the FBI manipulates the immigration process, which is a very crucial report because that was mostly in the dark. They had a client whose immigration was stalled for no reason, years, and finally sued and found out that the FBI has a practice of putting a national security hold on the progression of a person's immigration process. So it creates this incentive for the person to come to the government and say, what do I have to do? Which gives the FBI the upper hand to say, this is what you have to do. And with the implication that if you don't do it, the government won't fulfill its obligation to help you. Now, this has become dangerous in a couple of ways. One is what we highlight in the report, something where the FBI, the no-fly list has been changed to where it's no longer considered just an aviation security device. It's actually what they're calling a national security device. So it appears they're using it in a way to put people on the no-fly list so that they have to come to the government and ask, what's going on? I need to fly. Let me get off this list, which then results in the FBI saying, sure, we can get you off the list, become an informant. And again, for people who don't know criminals, it becomes this trap because if they know that if they agree to be an informant but then don't produce people to report on, that more harm will come to them. And even more dangerous is when this is happening overseas. So an American isn't on the list, gets on a plane, flies to a foreign country, spends his 2-week vacation. If they're anything like me, I have $13 left in my pocket when I'm going to the airport, just enough for the cab ride there to get on the plane and come home, only to find out they can't get on the plane. And then they're trapped in a desperate situation where they have to come to the government, and there's an FBI agent at the embassy saying, sure, we can get you off the list. All you have to do is agree to become an informant. And an even more dangerous policy of what we call proxy detention, and this is something we've asked Congress to look at, where Americans are being incarcerated abroad, often it appears at the request of the FBI, and often interrogated in a brutal manner and otherwise mistreated, even though there's no charge when they're ultimately released and come home. It's not as if these are criminals that are being arrested, but people that the FBI wants to leverage to collect information from. So we've asked Congress to look deeply at that, because that is very dangerous. When, under State Department rules, when an American is arrested, it's the obligation of the government to go and help them. And here we have a situation where the U.S. government is actually harming an American citizen as they travel abroad. It's a very dangerous practice that we have to know more about.
I have to look into you, and you have to elaborate on a couple of other things in terms of what Mike says, and then I have another question to pose before I open it up. He mentioned a fourth way in which people are asked to be informants in terms of what we call extrajudicial exile. This is what he said. When people are overseas, they're trying to fly home, and they're put on a no-fly list intentionally when they're overseas, and then they have to go check in, and then the FBI asks them to be an informant. Another one, the fifth one, relates to my initial point up here, where I said it's crucial, and it's very important that when you talk with federal law enforcement and the FBI, that it's best that you do it through an attorney. And I give you a specific case that took place here. A brother was approached by the FBI, and they were asking him some questions regarding people in Islamic charity. And Arab American, you want to be hospitable, ahlan wa sahlan, and come in, you want some tea, you want some cookies. And he sat back and talked with them without an attorney. Because he said, I had nothing to hide. I'm not going to lie, I have nothing to hide. So why not talk to them? He said, oh, thank you very much, Mr. Fulan bin Fulan. Later on, they come back later on and want to ask some more questions. So he lets them back in. Then they come back later on, and then he finally says he doesn't want to talk to them. And they said, well, Mr. Such and Such, Mr. Fulan bin Fulan, Sayyid Fulan bin Fulan, you told us on this date this particular information, but then when we came back to you 6 months later, you left this out, or you gave us a slightly different date. And do you know that giving false information to a federal law enforcement agent can get you in prison 3 to 5 years? So they threatened him that, oh, since you left off this information, you told us something slightly different, we're going to charge you with giving false information to us. And then which he did not, he stopped right there. He didn't act as the informant that they wanted him to. And then later on, there were some charges that were placed against him, and he ended up doing some months in federal prison, but on a lesser, he pled guilty to a lesser charge. So what I'm saying is that, and some of you probably know exactly what I'm talking about, but I went into detail. I mentioned charity. But this happened to someone in our community right here in Dearborn. So you're opening yourself up to liability, that when you start talking with them and open up a discussion or discourse with them, and always notice, and I mentioned this to Mike before, because they had the nerve to try to come to my office, and I told them, peace. They were trying to ask me some questions about someone. Okay? There's 2 agents. So one of them is asking the questions. One of them is being very silent. He's not saying anything. He's looking at your body motions. He's recording in his mind. He may have a recorder inside his pocket. I don't know. But what you're saying, and then he's the one that's observing, and then he's taking down the information about what you just said. And it's the nature of the human being, even in the language of the Quran in Arabic. Insan is related to the word linguistically tensa. It means to forget. So by nature, men and women over time, if they don't remember something often in their consciousness, they will forget a detail or two. Leaving off a detail or two can get you pressured to be an informant once you start talking with them. This is something that you have to and that you must understand. Now, one thing I'd like to get your opinion on this. In the Muslim community in certain cities, there have been these round tables that have been set up. We have one here called Bridges, in which federal law enforcement will grab ethnic organizations, Arab American organizations, might invite a Muslim organization here or there to have a discussion about things in the community. And we've seen since 9/11 that things have not improved at all between the relationship between law enforcement and the Muslim community. And in fact, we know that through these meetings that some people who've gone to these meetings have ended up being questioned by law enforcement once they come to the meetings, and then these meetings in fact have been used as type of like intelligence gathering. I attend these meetings just to see what's going on. I'm observing them. I don't think that these meetings are constructive at all, but I'd like to get your opinion on what you think about these meetings in which these tables are set up just to deal exclusively with the Arab and Muslim communities.
This is another very tough issue because it is the government's obligation to reach out and to understand the communities that they serve. You know, they can't serve you properly if they don't understand what your concerns are or what problems you're having. And the FBI's community outreach program now actually has, on paper, good guidelines for what they do with information that they obtain during these meetings to keep it out of intelligence files. The problem we discovered through our Freedom of Information Act request is that the intelligence side of the FBI mimics those community outreach efforts and pretends to be community outreach when they're really intelligence agents. And their purpose for being there is to collect information. And what we have obtained is that they are collecting purely First Amendment activity. How many people come to the mosque, what are their backgrounds, what nationalities they represent, where the women pray, where the men pray, you know, how many people come early in the morning, how many people come late at night, these sorts of things, how the mosque is laid out, you know, totally inappropriate things to exist in an FBI database. And the documents reflect not only that that information is treated as positive intelligence and retained in databases, but actually disseminated outside the FBI. We don't know where. So it's very clear. I mean, I believe that you know, interaction with those government agencies is very important to make sure they understand what your concerns are. But they have to be transparent in what they're doing, and you know, look at those documents and be prepared. And we at the ACLU are happy to help you to say, look, you know, we're happy to do community outreach, but we want to understand who you work for. Are you part of the community outreach? What program? What are you doing with information you collect? When I hand you my business card, is that going to end up in an intelligence database? And hold them to account and have them explain. I mean, one of the frustrations with that, we released those at about the same time we released the training. And the FBI was responsive to that training, but they have completely ignored this issue of masking the community outreach and exploiting the community outreach. And we've had long meetings, and they always send the community outreach people. And it's like, well, that's great, but it's not your program we're concerned about. It's the intelligence program. And they say, well, we don't have any control over that side of the house. It's like, well, that's the problem. They're using your program in a way that completely undermines it. But unfortunately, the FBI has not been responsive on that. And I think the way they will become responsive is when the communities work together to say that we won't have this. That if you're going to do community outreach, you have to do it in a transparent way where we all understand what it is you're trying to do. Let me just say I think DeWood is exactly right. The FBI is made up of human beings. Many of those human beings are very, very good people who care about their community and are trying to do the right thing. Unfortunately, many of them suffer under this horrible training, and like any human organization, there are some bad apples. But the FBI isn't a social community organization, right? They're law enforcement and intelligence agents. When they are coming to talk to you, they are not coming to talk to you, even if they're very friendly, to be your friend. They are talking to you because they are collecting information. That's what they do. That's their job, right? That's what we pay them tax dollars to do, is collect information about threats to the community. So when you're interacting with them, it's not a friendly relationship. They're actually collecting information, and they can lie to you about what they're doing. That's perfectly legal. But if you say something that's not entirely correct to them, they can hold that against you and put you in jail for it. So, in those situations, it's essential to reach out to CAIR, to reach out to the ACLU, and get legal representation, because there's basically going to be three types of contacts from what I've seen in the work that I do now. The FBI, because they have this informant requirement, are going to be out fishing. They're going to look for anything. So you're quoted in a news article about something in the community, they see your name, they'll call you and say, hey, I'd like to meet for coffee, and with the idea of trying to cultivate you as an informant. And those are entirely, if the lawyer calls and says, yes, we'd be happy to talk to you, they'll say, no, never mind, because it's not really about gathering any information. The second time is in relation to these suspicious activity reports. So somebody says, oh, there was a guy wearing Muslim garb taking a picture of the courthouse. Okay, their policy is they can't look at that and say, well, that's silly. The courthouse is an iconic building. Everybody takes photographs of. This is just the person who was reporting was racist. They have to go out and address those. They have to actually go and do an interview to resolve that suspicious activity. Huge waste of time. So when the lawyer calls and says, yes, we're happy to talk, he's going to say, oh, good, because I just need to clear this off. It's nothing, I just need to look at you and say, do you have any ill intent toward the United States? You tell me no, and I can go on to the next thing. And then the third type is investigations, where they're actually doing an investigation of someone and think that you know some information that might help them in their direct investigation. And that will be one where it will depend on the facts of that investigation, whether once they contact the attorney, they'll want to work with them. But typically when they don't want the attorney there, that's because they're trying to recruit you as an informant. They can't do that in front of an attorney in most cases. So that will help you understand it, but it is essential to seek legal representation to protect yourself.
I want to have Sister Nargis pass the mic around, but I'd like to make another comment. And he made a very important point, and I mentioned this to our Imams Committee, that the FBI, when they come to the masjid asking us to meet with the board or the Imams Committee, they're not coming to be your friend. Even if they come with a smile, they're not coming to be your friend. They're coming with a specific purpose, and a lot of that is relating to intelligence gathering. Just a very brief point that in terms of the New York Police Department spying on the Muslim community, Chief Kelly would meet with the imams. As a matter of fact, he invited them to the annual mayoral iftar dinner. And one of the imams, Imam of Beit al-Maqdis, is a masjid, a large masjid in Bay Ridge, Brooklyn. Bay Ridge is the Dearborn of New York City. Okay, he's sitting right at the table with Ray Kelly and Mayor Bloomberg, and then information comes out that they were spying on the same imam that they're talking to like they're his friend. And recently, Ray Kelly, the police chief of New York, in his defense of doing what they were doing, surveilling the Muslim community, He's saying, oh, well, people are just getting upset that we, the New York Police Department, are being proactive in doing what the Federal Bureau of Investigations does. Like, he tried to defend what they're doing by saying, we're just doing what federal law enforcement does in terms of our surveillance and our initial threat assessments. So, again, the I in FBI is there for a reason, investigations. It's not the Friends Bureau in investigations. Yeah, seriously. With that, I'm going to pass the mic to Sister Nargis, who's a CAIR Michigan staffer. I think Imam Ahmed Saleh had his hand up first.
Yeah, I think I had a few points. The one question I had is it possible to expose these informants? Is it legal to have wanted the Muslim community or something like that? Because they go around to different places, like with the case with the Albany imam that was in prison and these artificial terrorists that were created. The other is also another category of Muslims who voluntarily join the FBI. And what guidelines are we going to set for them? Because many women with hijab in Boston from Ivy League schools cannot find jobs. So these are jobs from the CIA and other places, and they feel it may be a type of halal income for them. So I've also had an experience after 9/11 where two people came to my house and my wife opened and her eyes went that half big and so on. They left two cards. I phoned Sheriff Akil and, well, there was no one responding to that. But when I asked other people later, they said, well, there are also non-FBI people going around to intimidate, maybe some of these Islamophobes. So I think it's so delicate and so awkward for us. My son came through from travel overseas, who are held up for 1 hour, and I thought I'm doing a good thing. He's a lifeguard and doing many things for the community, and yet he's so as you said, whether you have beard or no beard or whatever, you are still, you cannot win. It's a catch-22 situation. So just these few thoughts, but especially the one is that legal for us to just expose them.
So this is a very delicate thing. I think in the case you're talking about, it was an informant who actually testified, so it was very clear that that person was acting as an informant, and of course, their testimony is public, so once it's public that they're working as an FBI informant or have that information that can be distributed. I think it's a very dangerous thing, though, and this is really what's so disheartening about the FBI's using this technique because it's very destructive to communities. One of the techniques that the FBI used back in the COINTELPRO era under J. Edgar Hoover was what they called a snitch check. And what they would do is put information into the community either through anonymous letters or through other informants that a particular member of the community was an informant, even though they weren't, with the purpose of trying to get the community to react against them, sometimes violently, to destroy the cohesiveness of the community groups. So, you know, it's so destructive to our society because your community should not have to be going on mole hunts. And where there is actual evidence, they've testified, they've publicly admitted what they're doing, like the case in California where an informant came out and gave media interviews about what he was instructed to do. That's one thing, but trying to identify who is, unfortunately, I think that's the type of thing that actually destroys organizations, is that when they start pointing fingers at one another about who's suspect and who isn't suspect. So I just urge caution with that. If there's a person who you think is actually a provocateur trying to stir things up, I would contact the police. I mean, that's what they did in Southern California. And when the FBI didn't react appropriately as they would if this person was really a threat, they realized that he indeed was and actually got a restraining order against him, which is what compelled him to come forward was when the FBI didn't defend him in that hearing, saying, wait a minute, the FBI just sent me in here, and now I'm being publicly disparaged, and the FBI isn't saying, yes, we sent him in there. But again, I would urge that you do that with consultation with your legal representatives so that you make sure that you're staying within the law. But this is where your First Amendment activities are under threat, because how you address these situations when somebody's coming to you as a community leader with questions about world events, and that causes you concern, destroys the fabric of our society, and that's why I'm so active in trying to push back against this.
First of all, I want to thank CAIR and Imam Dawood for bringing this gathering together. Second, I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, for taking the time and effort and sharing your intelligence and feedback on everything that's going around. I think part of what I wanted to ask probably was answered through your next second segment, but going back to the informants. If the FBI was chosen in this beautiful country to serve and protect the people and the democratic values of our beautiful country, what makes the FBI, who is in this particular rank of serve and protect, go to a criminal that has no credibility to be an informant or to gather intelligence and information to plant on others? And then what is the credibility for that organization in the long run? And that goes at the same thing for the other informants. How could I get the right information, or what tell me that I'm going to be getting the truthfulness out of the informant if I'm putting that person under the pressure, whether it's financial or whether it's an immigration status or whether he was stranded outside the country so I can bring him back to his family? What makes me believe that, okay, this type of informant is really going to come forward and give me the right information so I can serve and protect and defend the values and the democratic values of this country? Thank you.
I think this is one of the areas where the FBI's methods have changed significantly. I mean, I used to do a lot of undercover work, particularly in neo-Nazi groups and anti-government militias. But if I had gone to them, to the FBI, and said, okay, I have this person who I believe is a neo-Nazi, and I'm going to open a case against them, they would say, okay, what type of weapons do they have access to? And if I said, well, they don't have any weapons of their own, they would have said, move along, right? I mean, they're not going to be a very effective terrorist if they don't have weapons. There are probably worse people out there. But unfortunately, that's not the way that the FBI is working now, where they're actually targeting individuals. I mean, in the case that I mentioned in Newburgh, the informant worked him for a year. Even after offering $250,000, it was only when he actually lost his job and didn't have an income at all that he agreed to do it. So, that kind of pressure, this was a person who was living hand to mouth. $250,000 was a life-changing amount of money, and that should never have survived scrutiny. The FBI should never have allowed it. The prosecutor never should have prosecuted a case where that was put on the table. The judge never should have let it go to a jury. It's really astonishing to me that that type of a case can survive. Because what we're seeing now is, there are a number of these cases. That's probably one of the more egregious ones. But there was one here in Chicago where an informant had given a person who was about to be homeless a place to live, given him a car, given him money to live, and then was encouraging him to plot. Where you can imagine this person knowing that if I don't go along with this informant's talk, he's going to put me out on the street. And comes up, he says, I want you to give me what plot you would do. And he said, well, maybe I'll get a kitchen knife and stab a judge. Not really the type of terrorist plot that's going to put the FBI on the front page of the paper. So the informant says, no. How about doing bombing at a shopping mall? And he says, well, yeah, I guess that would do something, but I don't have any money. I don't have any bombs. No worries. I have a friend who has them. And he'll sell you 4 hand grenades for $100. Right? I know from black market stuff, nobody's going to sell 1 hand grenade for $100, much less 4. That's something that's very hard to get for good reason. And the guy says, well, I can't get $100. Now, in my mind, as an investigator, that would tell me this guy really doesn't want to do this. It's not that hard to come up with $100, particularly if you're a desperate criminal and terrorist. So the undercover agent that they bring in to sell the hand grenade says, well, what do you have? And he says, well, really the only thing that I own are these 2 used stereo speakers. I'll take them. Here's 4 hand grenades, you're under arrest. And that case, again, survives scrutiny. It is highly problematic. Trevor Aronson, a journalist, wrote a book called The Terror Factory that details a lot of these cases, and I urge you to read it and have people in your community read it just so they'll understand this technique the FBI is using. But now we are seeing them use that in other types of cases. There was recently a case in Cleveland where some people who called themselves anarchists, was the same thing where they were given a lot of explosives by an informant who was actually their boss. He had given them jobs because they were all, again, destitute and homeless and were going to disperse in the wind, so he gave them jobs and a place to live so that they would be together so that he could continue to cajole them along, and eventually gave them explosives that they went to jail for. So what's done in one community that other Americans might say, well, that's not my community, so I'm not worried about it, eventually will come around and get them too. So that's why it's so important that we all stand up when anybody's rights are being infringed. And I think what Dawood said is so critical. That, this type of law enforcement activity, this type of FBI activity is not new. This is things they've been doing at different periods of crisis throughout the history of the United States, and there are groups that have gone through this before us, and we need to make sure that they understand that this is their rights as much as it's our rights that we're fighting for, and that we should all be one in fighting against it.
Thank you, Dr. Dawood, for organizing the event. Mike, thank you for coming over here. The question is general question. There are more than 90 masjid over here in the state of Michigan, and there are a lot of imams, more than 100. So specific steps they can take to make the image more clear to the government that they are compliant with those things that you are talking about. So is there any specific step in the compliance issue for the denounce of the Michigan address? More in compliance. Thank you.
I appreciate the question and where the question is coming from, because obviously it's not any American's obligation to convince the government they're innocent, and it just shows sort of how twisted this has become. I do believe in interacting with the government and reaching out to the FBI again through legal counsel, either CAIR, making sure that your rights are protected. But I believe in education, and I believe you can educate these government people and push back against this training that they're getting. Making sure that the purpose is for them to serve you, not for them to collect information about you. And I think that can go a long way towards doing things and being in solidarity with the community. I mean, one of the things that's always difficult is when, and again, when you read these materials, the FBI seems to think that the Muslim community is one monolithic thing, whereas I said it's very distinct communities within a community, which is difficult for the FBI to understand. But sure that we all support one another when there's an issue coming up where the government is trying to push one group to the side and marginalize one group, that we all speak with one voice. And that's not just within the Muslim community, but within the civil rights and civil liberties community writ large. And it's just making sure that you're tied in and have good relations with other groups. I think is the best way to do it. And I wish I had a more clear answer than that. But you know, this is why it's such a difficult problem with the FBI. You know, giving an organization like the FBI this kind of authority is very dangerous in a free state, in a free democracy.
And let me add on. You know, I think that, and I say to this community leaders, we are under no obligation as citizens to prove our innocence. It's basically what Mike said. I think that there's an educational piece in trying to push back legislatively, and then also the understanding that we have to do as much as we have to do education. There will always be individual officers or agents who will be bigots. You know, that will never be totally eradicated, no matter how safe you try to make yourself to be. And I'll give you an example that took place about 4 years ago. There is a millionaire, tenured professor at Harvard University by the name of Skip Gates. I don't know if you've ever heard of him before. He lives in this very affluent community, Cambridge, Massachusetts. One of the only black people that lives in the neighborhood. He was bringing stuff into his house, not taking stuff out. He was bringing some things into his house, left his keys in the house, and went to go into his own house, and someone called the police on him, and even after he identified this was his house, he got arrested for on suspicion of burglary. He's black in this all-white neighborhood, millionaire, tenured professor, published books, documentaries. Out of all this, and he even has conservative politics too. Out of all of this, this didn't safeguard him from that officer doing what he did to him. So this is very instructive for those who think that, who have the model immigrant mentality, that think that they just try to prove themselves safe enough to the government and acquire this much money and live in this neighborhood that's going to protect them from racial, ethnic, or religious profiling. It just doesn't work that way. I had to say that. It doesn't work that way.